There has always been a battle between art and commerce in the Canadian film industry. American monopolies have made it difficult for Canadian film to make a name for itself, so our government has responded by setting up systems that nurture homegrown art. But despite this, the majority of Canadian films still go unnoticed by the world outside our industry, and worst of all, by Canadians themselves. What went wrong here? Well, Wayne Clarkson, the former director of Telefilm, one of our biggest funding bodies, once said that if Canada wanted to make commercial movies, they'd just make Dumb and Dumber. And I think that may be the heart of the problem. Maybe our funding systems are a little too focused on the art side of things. We have a whole bunch of public and private funding initiatives that aspiring filmmakers can access, the most notable of which is Telefilm Canada, formerly known as the Canadian Film Development Corporation, or the CFDC. Back in 1964, a committee got together to talk about placing a stronger focus on developing feature films in Canada. And like every other problem in the world, the biggest issue came down to money. As an answer to the dilemma, the government came up with the CFDC, which would provide seed capital in the form of loans to Canadian producers so they would have the funds to make feature films. In the years between 1913, when the first Canadian feature was made, and 1967, when the CFDC was established, only 237 features were made. That's in 5 decades. But this number would explode in the 1970s and 80s. This was what we now call the tax shelter era, a period where investors could deduct 100% of investments in Canadian features from their taxable income. This is a huge incentive to make movies. So unsurprisingly, the number jumped from 3 films made in 1974 to 77 films in 1979. Bonkers. Out of the tax shelter era, we got some pretty memorable films, like The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz and Why Shoot the Teacher, but for the most part, the films of this era, most of which were produced by the CFDC, were considered commercial hacks, to put it lightly. Stuff like Blackout and David Cronenberg's Shivers were not exactly making the industry proud of its exports. Taxpayers were pretty mad that this is what their money was going towards, and they reduced the deduction to 50% in 1982. The CFDC's entire job was to give funding to films that promoted Canadian culture. So people were like, what is the point of you? The CFDC became Telefilm in 1984, following a suggestion from a report that television would be a good way for Canadian features to get seen without the obstacle of theater screenings. You know, Telefilm. Now, much of the focus was on broadcasting, and in 1986 we got a feature film fund, which was meant to combat all the negative attention from the tax shelter era by putting money towards films that were, quote, culturally relevant.
Growing up in the 90s and in the early aughts, that like, oh, Canadian cinema meant art film. It meant quiet dramas about weird stuff. But it's just the idea that like, oh, we're going to tackle subjects that are too taboo for Hollywood. I think for a while, Telefilm was supporting movies like that.
This is where the big issue comes in. Telefilm has done wonderful things for this industry. When the private sector is flailing, public intervention is necessary, and it can make feature filmmaking much more accessible to people who might not have the resources.
If you ever have like any kind of mystery as to how people are like making these like web series or TV shows or whatever, and they're like making a living off of it, this is probably the reason why. It just makes so much sense once you actually understand what Telefilm or, you know, CCA is. It's crazy how much money they have and how much of it is like the infrastructure for like keeping all of this afloat, I think.
But the system can also be kind of limiting. There have been quite a few Canadian success stories in the film industry that have found their success outside of Telefilm. A good example is My Big Fat Greek Wedding, which was denied funding by Telefilm, but which went on to be one of the highest grossing films in the world that year as a Canadian-American co-production. To be fair, My Big Fat Greek Wedding, the cute sleeper hit that it is a major outlier in terms of what movies garner that amount of financial success. But it's just one of many memorable films that didn't receive any help from Telefilm. Adan Arjuit, a Canadian epic about an Inuit legend, applied to Telefilm but was offered only a fraction of what regular English and French films would get, simply because it was told in the Inuktitut language. They've since expanded their language requirements to include Indigenous languages, but are now facing criticisms about their limitations with regards to basically every other language. Adan Arjuit actually went on to be one of the highest grossing Canadian films in history. Something similar happened with the 2022 film Skinamarink, which enjoyed a significant amount of commercial success despite its $15,000 crowd-funded budget. Or another 2022 film Therapy Dogs, which director Ethan Eng funded all on his own at the age of 17.
I worked at McDonald's, and then I was working as like a video editor at a music studio during the summer. The key is I didn't know how to use a debit card, so I literally like never spent any of my money, and I had like $10,000 saved up by the end of it. And I just showed up to school one day with $10,000 like in my jacket. And then I was like, I'm buying a camera with this. We gotta do it. We gotta just like go all in and make a feature film. The thing with doing that is it's like, because you're putting everything into it, you really you have no choice but to try as hard as you can.
It seems Canadian cinema operates on a bit of a highbrow model of filmmaking, ever since the embarrassment of the tax shelter era, which, let's be real, that's the era that gave us Cronenberg. Shivers is actually pretty awesome. And just look where he is today. In a 2006 interview for Maclean's, director and actor Paul Gross had this to say: "Telefilm is floundering. It's a public service paid for by the Canadian people, but we're not making movies that people want to see. If we made roads that nobody wanted to drive on, that would be hard to defend as a public service." Gross thinks that Canada's aversion to commercial filmmaking is really setting it back, and he actually responds to Wayne Clarkson's Dumb and Dumber comment by saying, "We should be so lucky as to make Dumb and Dumber. It takes a certain amount of cinematic courage to stick your tongue to a pole for 2 minutes and hope the audience doesn't leave." And you know, he might just be right. But there have been recent efforts on the part of Telefilm to tap into the zeitgeist.
I think that there is starting to be a little bit more awareness of Canadian films, of new Canadian voices. Matt and I consulted on the Talent to Watch program 5 or 6 years ago when it transitioned from what was the micro budget program. And that was really our main idea behind that, was we need to, not just give a little bit of resources, but a lot of resources, because we wanted to fund a lot of films at once. Talent to Watch is designed to help first feature directors get their first movies made. When you apply, you can get up to $250,000 from Telefilm. And unlike other programs at Telefilm, that can make up 100% of your budget. Basically, it's a talent development program. It was sort of looking at Telefilm and saying, well, you have your regional program and you have a national program, but what do you do when you either finish film school or you're 25 years old and you're like, I want to make a film? And so we like the idea of having a program that was specifically for those people. I don't think Telefilm is setting the taste. I think they're reacting to it. I don't think it's their responsibility to identify what a Canadian film is or what a Canadian filmmaker is. I think that's our job as the filmmakers. It's, if I make this movie here and I'm a Canadian, isn't that a Canadian movie? Like, what else does it take? And I don't think any other national cinema in the world thinks about their movies in those terms.
But on top of the perceived snootiness of Canada's funding bodies, there's also another problem lurking around here: marketing. Telefilm, since its CFDC days, has been really great at the production side of things. They help to get hundreds of films produced here every year. But when it comes to actually getting people to see these films, they seem to fall kind of short. And this is because Telefilm has been largely uninterested in its role in the distribution side of things. This lopsided approach is best captured in Telefilm's budget caps. For distribution, Telefilm's marketing program is kind of modest, only covering up to a maximum of $75,000 per film. Yet there is no maximum budget for their production fund. So what ends up happening is that many distributors collect the money because it's already there, but lack incentive and resources to release the film. Added to that, distributors have historically been more inclined to sell broadcasting rights to television, so they don't have to spend as much money trying to get their film into theaters. So it goes like this: American dominance has led to government intervention, and too much government intervention has led to overly commercial movies. The public got angry that their tax dollars were being spent on those movies, and so the government privileges highbrow movies and misses out on stuff that the public might actually want to see, or at least doesn't spend enough time distributing the movies it does make so that the public can actually see it. And the actual distributors? Well, that's a story for next time.